Well, I think it's about that time. After months of putting it off, I am finally giving in. So many people have been asking for an updated power rankings video for the longest time, but every time I received this request, I kind of just turned it down in the past. In all honesty, I thought doing a full-blown power rankings would be extremely difficult to pull off this year, and I still do kind of feel this way even though we're going through with this. Given the different philosophies of the two regions, I thought it was going to be tough to make comparisons. Like, let's not forget that the only APAC team to play someone from NA was Seoul Dynasty, I believe. But now that the regular season is over and we're waiting for the playoffs to start, now seems like a good time to do it since we have a lot of downtime. And keep in mind that I'm not 100% sure on everything you see on this list. I think a bunch of it is up for debate. I've been changing things up until the very last second. Also keep in mind that this order doesn't always go by which team is better than another. Much of this list is actually based off of how teams performed in my eyes during the regular season. I'm looking more towards their accomplishments, like who they beat, and their overall strength. So try to keep that in mind for a team who you think is worse or better than where I put them. Anyway, here we go. Here are my end of season regular season power rankings for Overwatch League Season 3. So starting at the number 20 spot, it will come to a surprise to absolutely nobody that I have the Boston Uprising. I don't think a single soul is going to disagree with me on this one unless you're a diehard Boston fan, let's say. Heading into preseason, they were number 20, and here they still are claiming it like half a year later. It is undeniable that they have been considerably worse than everybody else when looking at the grand scheme of things. Given their 2 wins on the season, it's pretty clear to me and most people that they had the least amount of peaks out of anybody else in the league. Myeongbong has been one of the only consistent bright spots. Everybody else has been crazy high and low. They're all over the place. Even when Boston were winning, it really wasn't what you'd call pretty. They haven't had a single complete game under their belt so far. There's been no order. They've shown very, very low levels of cooperation and synergy. Besides a few energy spikes here and there, they've looked boomed for like 3/4 of this year. If Super is openly coming out on stream saying that Boston have looked worse than Season 1 Shanghai at times during scrims lately, then there is something seriously wrong with your team. They are the worst team in the league without a doubt. Their players look so defeated, and I expect that to translate into their playoff efforts. Moving on to the number 19 spot is the Vancouver Titans. I went back and forth on whether I wanted these guys in the 18 spot or the 19 spot, because technically speaking, they do have more wins than the Washington Justice in the standings. However, I think you kind of have to discredit 2 of those wins since they came while the runaway roster was still around back in week 1 of this year. If you look at the roster that played a majority of this season, the Vancouver Titans have won 4 matches and lost 13 of them without including any of their tournament stuff. And half of those wins were against Boston of all teams. Sure, they beat the Atlanta Reign, but I mean, Washington beat the Gladiators. That's pretty much the equivalent. The Titans also just feel less versatile to me. We've already seen that specific metas can ruin them. When Genji was around for a good month or so, they were never winning any games practically. They are a team who takes a long time to adjust, and their game planning is very one-dimensional and easy for teams to get a read on. They can beat pretty much any other team at their skill level in North America, but they don't have the feats for me to rate them any higher as they haven't really gotten those wins against those teams. They have great potential, but they just haven't realized it yet. Moving on to the 18th place spot, I kind of already hinted at it, but I have the Washington Justice. While their recent acquisition of Decay excites me greatly, we have to look at their season as a whole since he was only a part of the team for 1 game. For a lack of better words, the Washington Justice results have been quite lackluster. Their losses tend to be quite lopsided a lot of the time. When they're not winning, they get outclassed. They've gone through retirements and their fair share of hardship, so it's completely understandable in my opinion. And it's not like their entire team has been extremely reliable or anything. The Genji meta is the only time this team showed true prowess. The Justice have major issues that simply have not been resolved by themselves. For one, there's the issue of Roar. In a majority of cases, he's been a low-tier main tank player. Roar appears to be too stubborn to change his ways for whatever reason. He's over-aggressive, and his game is filled with holes. It's very easy to get exposed as a weak point for him. Arc is in a similar boat, but more because of him just being passive and not really contributing all that much. As for everybody else, they've been inconsistent and have only been extremely dependable in specific weeks or metas. Decay might help turn this around, but their regular season as a whole has been bottom tier, so I think putting them in the bottom 3 is very necessary. Moving on to the number 17 spot is the Toronto Defiant. They've had a rough go at it this year, but have found success against the opponents around their skill level, and they even hit a decent peak during the Summer Showdown by defeating the Valiant, albeit a weaker version of them, and the Atlanta Reign. A top 4 finish in a tournament is better than anything Washington, or anybody below them for that matter, has accomplished this year. but being better than Washington, Boston, and Vancouver does not tell you much. Sure, you can beat all of them every single time, but it's not a big achievement to celebrate. They've gotten a few upsets this year and have pushed a few good teams or decent teams back, but most of their performances have not been all that impressive, I feel. They aren't a team that scare you heading into the playoffs. They're filled with players who just don't cut it, and it often feels like they lack direction still. Numlocked and Cruz joining the team has helped, but they're still lacking in that department. I honestly do believe that a hole at the leadership position never got filled after head coach Feifei decided to leave the team. It helps that Surefour, aka one of their more consistent players and one of their more vocal players, has been losing his passion to play the game. These holes have left the Defiant in a state of confusion the entire year. They don't know where to go next. That lack of focus makes them weak, hence why they're part of the bottom 4 despite their 15th place finish. Number 16, the London Spitfire. You know, I really wanted to put London higher, but I think that would be an absolute mistake. I know that London played and beat a few NA teams this year, but that was at the beginning of the season. I know it's not exactly fair because they play in a very tough region, but their resume after joining the APAC region does leave a lot to be desired. If I remember correctly, they've only defeated 2 out of the 6 teams that they could play against in that region. They beat Chengdu twice and the Spark that one time. Their only other noteworthy achievement is taking Shanghai 5 maps a couple of times, but I don't think the Dragons were really taking those matches all that seriously at the time. I think some people are going to be mad at me for putting them below the team I have at 15 and maybe even 14, but London haven't really done anything since the early stages of the year, and those wins were by no means super clean. All of those early NA wins came in 5 map scenarios. Sure, it proves they can be clutch, but having to go that far to begin with shows they don't have what it takes to be dominant and decisive. Listen, London are a young team. They put together a team full of prospects from all over the place in Korea. Because they are so inexperienced and they have not really played a lot together prior, they don't have the greatest coordination. Even if they can have higher peaks than some of the teams above them on this list, they lack the teamwork that those teams do. London are much more based on individual efforts than plays set up through the efforts of multiple people. The coaching can't really seem to break their players out of this bad habit. This especially goes for their inconsistencies at main tank and flex DPS. London have shown they are capable of great things. Now it's just a matter of getting to that level consistently. But until then, 16th is where they stay. Moving on to 15th place, I've got the Dallas Fuel. The Fuel certainly had a wild year. Even with all the craziness, they were still able to rack up 9 wins, which is pretty respectable given how many times they've played powerhouse teams this year. As usual, Fuel fans were put on an emotional roller coaster. There were some tough moments, but also some insanely exciting heroics from the likes of Decay. Guys like Note and Doha also made a fairly big impact. Note having a bounce back year in particular alongside his friend Gamsu was great to see. There's been some shining moments for sure if you're the Dallas Fuel. But even so, there's been a lot of hardships. There's the falling out with Decay, the constant flip-flopping between 3 players at the main support position, and some tough losses to bear witness to. But you know what? I'm still pretty proud of Dallas. They did a decent job of dealing with this all. Only finishing 2 wins below even throughout all the chaos is pretty nice. This is the most composure this franchise has ever shown me, and I think the fans would agree with me. Unfortunately though, I can't rank this team very high this year. Their record was okay, yeah, but they didn't really beat anybody noteworthy, now did they? Their peaks weren't really anything massive. Beating the Valiant and their Texas rivals a few times is pretty good, but that's about it. The Valiant weren't even that good back then either. They still hadn't really hit their stride. They also couldn't really do anything against teams like the Gladiators, Reign, or Mayhem, unlike some of the other teams above them. Almost beating the Shock is cool, I will admit that, but almost doesn't really count for much. Some people may be a little upset by me ranking them this low, but I can't help it. They haven't really done enough. Number 14, the Houston Outlaws. Funny enough, these guys are in the same spot as I had them in the preseason. Let me get this out of the way. I'm sure there's more than a few people down in the comment section who will not agree with me putting Houston above Dallas, and I'm not going to take that away from you. It's your opinion. But just hear me out. Let me explain myself. I am well aware that the Fuel beat them twice. It is a fair argument to be made. Dallas have proven to be a better team in the head-to-head. But keep in mind, again, that this is not the only criteria I'm using. You have to think about the big picture. It goes back to the peak argument again. The Fuel's biggest accomplishments were defeating the Outlaws and the Valiant, I would say. Houston, on the other hand, defeated Florida when they were known to everybody already as a top 4 team in NA. And they did so in a tournament scenario nonetheless. And let's not forget that they did expose Paris that one time, even though the Eternal weren't really at 100% during that matchup. Because you have to look at it from both ways. The Fuel also played that same Paris team and they got demolished. So I think that proves to everybody that the Outlaws have done more and that they can beat better teams. Moving away from this whole Dallas-Houston argument though, the Outlaws have had a pretty bizarre year. There were so many tough moments where they either kept getting dominated or they would just come up short against a rival like Dallas or Florida. We've seen main tank changes among other lineup rotations occur too, but through it all, they've had shining stars in the mix in the likes of Dante and Meko and a decent supporting cast with Jexa and Repel. But that's the thing. The Outlaws have relied heavily on the play of their superstars, and the team ends up flopping when they can't do enough usually. When guys like Linkser or Hydration play well enough, the tough games do become winnable. But if the Outlaws can't play that complete game, it all comes back to Dante and Meko, and what usually happens is they make a valiant effort, but to no avail. The Outlaws are a few pieces away from being any sort of consistent threat. Their poor record and failure to help their stars lands them the number 14 spot. Coming in at the number 13 spot is the Chengdu Hunters. So this one may be a little questionable given how inconsistent they've been this year. However, unlike Houston or Dallas, Chengdu have shown the ability to upset more than one good team in their region. They may have only 8 wins and a bunch of them came at the end of the year and everything, but they have successfully taken down everybody else in that region at least one time. And I don't think I need to tell any of you that there aren't a lot of free wins to be found in APAC usually. So the fact that Chengdu got 8 wins to begin with is already very impressive. The upsets over Shanghai, Guangzhou, and New York prove to me that they have what it takes to even throw off the toughest teams in the league. The main issue with Chengdu though that I have is that most of the time they feel pretty meta dependent. If we don't see dive heavy or other chaotic compositions come into play, they tend to fail more often than not. The metas that were around the most were the ones they weren't good at. That inconsistency makes them middle of the pack, regardless of what region they're from. Number 12, the Atlanta Reign. If you went back in time and told me I had the Reign of all teams middle of the pack, I would have called you crazy. The Atlanta Reign were hyped up a good amount. Their team was stacked on paper, and yet the potential they had was never realized. Instead of being a top team, they are nothing more than a tier 2 NA squad. It's been the same old story the entire season. They cannot accomplish anything noteworthy. They can literally beat anybody below them or some of the teams at their level like the Valiant, but the moment they play a team in the upper half of the NA region, it's nothing but a disaster. All I'm gonna say is the Atlanta Reign should be thankful they played as many easy games as they did. I give them credit for taking care of business, but I can't overlook their poor performances against the good teams. Out of every team ahead of them in the North American standings, they have only beaten the Valiant and the Mayhem, and I don't think I have to remind any of you that the Valiant weren't really in the best shape. They came off of probably the worst week of their lives mentally, and the Mayhem before they hit their stride back during the early stages of the year. And that's not a resume to be extremely proud of, now is it? Between some of their players not living up to expectations and the coaches not doing a proper job, the Atlanta Reign have flopped, so I think placing them here is deserved. Number 11, the Hangzhou Spark. This is another place where I think my list starts to get kind of controversial. The Spark really aren't a bad team at all, so it was not easy for me to put them so low. But the fact of the matter is that the Hangzhou Spark have kind of just been meh this year. The Spark honestly do have a nice team. I like their roster quite a bit, and I think acquiring Architect mid-season made them a true threat. I can definitely see a world in which they make some serious noise in the playoffs. They have plenty of playmakers, and they have the improved coaching to pull it off. But of course, we're looking at how their season went as a whole, and it's not all that amazing. I know it's not an easy thing to pull off, but it's still worth noting that they are the only Chinese expansion team this year to have not beaten Shanghai, and generally speaking, they're one of only 2 teams to not pull off this upset in general. I will say though, they've been pretty good with winning their other games in convincing fashion. There's a lot of 3 and 4 map victories under their belts, but they have been blasted a good amount to go along with it unfortunately. They've had plenty of losses where they've looked pretty lost. And this continued even when they finally got their off-tank situation figured out and when they traded for Architect. With the exception of the Countdown Cup and a big win over the NYXL and the Charge, the results have not been all that great for them. And I don't even think their Countdown Cup run was anything special since they were placed in the easier part of the bracket. They didn't have a difficult path to get there, and yet they still almost lost in the first round. The Spark have the appropriate roster to be competitive, but they still lack answers for whatever reason. I don't feel right about placing a team super high if they are still kind of soul-searching, so to speak. And just like that, we have reached the second half of my power rankings. At the 10 spot, I have the LA Gladiators. Yeah, I'm aware this one may be kind of questionable. I totally get it. But to be completely honest, I think they've had the slightly better overall season than Hangzhou. The Spark have theoretically had the higher peak, but I think the Gladiators have had a few more of those major victories that the Spark lack. I know they were having an off week, but they still did defeat the Shock, who have consistently been a top team of the NA region. Another thing that puts their season slightly higher than the Sparks is their overall success versus rivals. The Gladiators have prevailed over the Valiant and Reign 4 times out of 4. They have been able to take down the opponents considered to be at their level every single time. The Glads tend to show more fight as well, I feel. They usually don't go down so easily in their losses. Not many 3-0s to be seen on that schedule. Guys like Birdring and Space have willed this team to victory time after time. There are some real superstars on that team, but they still have their fair share of problems to work on. The coaching has found mixed results and have relied greatly on weird strategies to win games at times. There also have been some clear weaknesses in certain metas that have slowed them down. The double shield meta did not always treat them very kindly. I think guys like OG and Big Goose were having a down year when they had to play in that meta. Another issue is their lack of success in tournaments. Lots of early exits to go around with them. And another thing before I forget, they've had a few bad slip-ups from time to time, like when they lost to Boston, Washington, and Houston. Everyone else above them tends to not really have as many of these types of slip-ups. Rolling in at the number 9 spot is the Seoul Dynasty. So this is where I had to make a hard decision. I was tempted to put the Dynasty as high as 8th and as low as 11th. I only say you can argue them higher because of their peaks. When this team is firing on all cylinders, they can accomplish more than most in the league. Winning a game against Shanghai early in the season and pushing them to the brink in the May Melee is praiseworthy, even though again that doesn't count as a W. Meanwhile, the Spark have never really come close to beating Shanghai, so I think that kind of explains why I have the Dynasty higher. And unlike some other teams like the Spark and Gladiators, let's say, the Dynasty have snagged wins against every other team in the region, whether it be through tournament play or a regular season game. Getting a few bonus wins also shows that they can be clutch in tournaments as well. But where Seoul have succeeded, they've also found a lot of failure. Let's call it how it is. Their play during the regular season was quite sloppy at times. If you exclude their tournament wins and the bonuses that came with it, we're looking at a 9-win team. Between beating Shanghai and their recent strong finish was a lot of tough losses. And that's my biggest problem with them. A lot of the time, they show me no fight when a team gives them a hard time early on. There's no grit. They can't figure things out for whatever reason. They lack adaptation and mental fortitude. 9 out of their 15 combined season and tournament losses were 3-0s. Getting crushed more than half of the time is not a very good look. Now, I will say, 3 of those times were against the Shanghai Dragons, so they get some slack there, but getting demolished that much still is kind of bad nonetheless. They have the accomplishments I'm looking for, but they lack the grit. Number 8. The LA Valiant. This is probably the final questionable one in the rankings before we start to stabilize. By a lot of people's logic, the Gladiators should be above the Valiant for beating them twice and proving to be the better team in the 1v1. And that is completely fair. If that's what you want to base it off of, then be my guest. But I think the Valiant undoubtedly have had the better season despite these two only being separated by a win in the standings. The team that completely surpassed my preseason expectations has demonstrated higher peaks. Not only have they beaten the Shock and the Rangers like the Glads, but they've also beaten Florida twice and Paris that one time in the May Melee. Let's not forget that the Gladiators played the exact same version of this Paris team with no Sparkle or Xe, and they were defeated. And how about the tournament results? The Valiant have actually made the top 4, unlike the Glads. One other thing I loved about this Valiant team that makes me put them at the 8th spot is the minimal amount of slip-ups they've had this year. Besides that tournament loss to Toronto, they've been pretty good with winning the games you'd expect them to for the most part. Packing 10 coaches those guys very well. What kind of keeps the Valiant from leveling up, though, is them simply not being good enough. It sounds absurdly bland and basic, but it happens to be the truth. As surprising as the Valiant have been, their peak seems to be competing around the level of Florida and Paris sometimes. They can't really do any better. They lack the necessary star power to reach the top. They kind of need the meta to be pretty favorable for them. KSB has to be on his comfort picks, and it helps when Shaxx can play the Tracer. But sometimes they end up over-relying on somebody like KSB, which results in teams focusing him down. It's an exploitable weakness that most of the good teams are always going to use against them in a majority of scenarios. The Valiant are a good team, but not a great one. Number 7. The Florida Mayhem. The Mayhem kick off the list of teams who are above the rest of the pack in my opinion. This Mayhem squad has found constant success throughout all of the regular season. While they don't have a ridiculous amount of achievements under their belts, they did accomplish more than most. They're one of 3 teams to beat the Philly Fusion this year. They joined the elite company of Paris and the Shock to do so. That definitely counts for something, does it not? And they've challenged those teams as well. And I mean, they got a 2nd place finish in the MMA Melee, that's pretty solid, and their 4th place finish in the NA region and their top 6 record overall is well deserved. They have a very well-rounded team with carries at tank, DPS, and support. The DPS in particular have been shining stars for this roster. I would argue that Yaki and BQB are one of the top tier DPS duos in the Overwatch League most of the time. I mean, Yaki is literally in the MVP conversation this year. That's how you know this team has been doing something right. People have taken notice of them, but the Mayhem have weaknesses still. As good as they've been, they often struggle to win the long, drawn-out games that are super gritty and tough. When their opponent pushes them back, they don't really seem to adapt a lot of the time. The moment their plan gets disrupted, it all goes to hell for whatever reason. That's not title contender material. It's something that puts them slightly behind in my opinion. Number 6, the New York Excelsior. I'll tell you right now, this is why I don't really like ranking everybody all together. In terms of pure feats, Florida have beaten a team at the level of Shanghai. Meanwhile, New York are still searching for that kind of victory. However, they've been pretty good with beating everybody else. New York Shanghai Bugaboo is the equivalent of Florida not being able to defeat the Shock, I guess. And yeah, New York never made a finals appearance in the tournaments, but it's not something I hold against them, as the APAC region is a difficult region to play in, and they've often gotten a pretty tough matchup/road to get to the finals to begin with. I just feel that relatively speaking, it is more impressive that the NYXL can beat everybody except for one team in APAC. On any given day, they can be a top 2 team in their region, but that's my main issue here. Keyword is they can be, as in they aren't always at that level. There are moments in time where they have been knocked down. The NYXL are kind of lacking in some departments still. Their coaching and coordination could use some work surprisingly. There's too much of a divide, I feel, between their over-aggressive players and everybody else. Guys like Jonak and Hoxel have made the lives of their teammates difficult, and Hoppa too when he's in the game. The best of the best don't deal with these types of issues. They just don't. The New York Excelsior are lacking, and I think that some metas have put this weakness on full display. I'll be honest, this has been a rather shaky season for the NYXL. The team and their fans aren't really accustomed to seeing this much of a struggle during regular season play. Even through their tournament and playoff choking in the past, they were usually still a top team record-wise. This has been a down year in terms of New York standards. Let's see if they can turn it around and finish strong. Number 5, the Guangzhou Charge, aka the other team who can be the second best in APAC at any given day. At the beginning of the season, this team didn't have it easy. There was a lot of inconsistency and the losses to Shanghai kept on piling up. But once Double Shield became a major stay in the meta, the flip was switched. From week 13 to week 27, if you combine all of their games including their tournament ones, they won 14 of their final 16 matches if I did my math correctly. This includes 2 wins over the NYXL and a Summer Showdown Grand Finals victory against the Dragons. They've got the results to be considered a top 5 team without a doubt. They have 2 MVP candidates and a seriously good team system, but there's an ongoing issue with the Charge currently. When Double Shield is not the meta, they seem to struggle at times. Double Shield is the only meta they've truly excelled at, and as good as their team is, they get outclassed against the New Yorks and Shanghais of the world in a dive meta. They don't possess the same level of versatility and coordination as other top teams in North America and Asia in a non-Double Shield meta. With Orisa and Sigma getting nerfed greatly, the Charge have to prove themselves during the playoffs. Number 4, the Paris Eternal. This is where it gets hard to say anything bad about these teams. Paris have greatly blown away any expectations I had for them. This team has been rejuvenated thanks to the arrival of their rookies and head coach Rush, along with the likes of Ben Best and Nico having turnaround seasons. This Paris team has a very, very nice flow to it. Every person involved plays a role in their success, and they've been strong across pretty much every meta. And Paris have already proved they can literally beat anybody at their peak. Their run in the Summer Showdown shows us this. If you are like the only team to beat both the Shock and the Fusion, and you manage to finish top 4 in the standings and win a regular season tournament, then you deserve to be this high up. There's no doubt. Their young stars are too nasty for their own good, as they can compete with pretty much anybody else in the league at their positions. The Paris Eternal are insane, but I can't put them any higher up simply because they haven't showcased the same level of dominance as everybody else above them. This is where record and the amount of blowout victory starts to put them behind. Number 3. The Philadelphia Fusion. What a year for Philly, let me tell ya. They truly played up to their potential. Carpe and Alarm are leading this team with MVP caliber seasons, but don't underestimate everybody else. They've been superstars in their own right. The best record in NA, a top 2 record in the league, 2 top 2 finishes in regular season tournaments. Those are some very nice accolades. Not to mention they have over 20 wins with 5 total losses on the season if you include the tournament blunders. That goes to show you how dominant they've really been. Tournament choking or not, they have the consistency that only a few teams can match. And you know, I think them not letting those tournament losses get to them shows you how strong they are mentally. Some teams might end up being totally boomed after all those failures, but not the Fusion. They came back strong every single time. When they failed against Paris, they came back and beat them in the next tournament. When they failed against San Francisco, they beat them the following week. That's how you know they are a good team. They learn from their mistakes, they study their shortcomings, and they adapt. The Fusion have proven themselves as title contenders without a shadow of a doubt. Number 2, the San Francisco Shock. Despite finishing second place in NA, they still accomplished more than Philly in my eyes. 2 tournament victories kind of speaks for itself. They've literally beaten everybody in North America, and they have nothing left to prove in this region. And they have 4 slip-ups the whole season if you include the Summer Showdown loss to Paris. And I think the Shock deserves some credit here. They saw their former MVP and team leader Sinatra retire for a different game, and they traded away Architect, who has been there since Season 1 as one of the more reliable playmakers. And yet, they press onwards like nothing has ever happened. Dominance still has a distinct presence with this franchise, and they do it better than 90% of other teams out there, I'd say. Their superior coaching has kept them well equipped for every single meta. The Shock are just too darn flexible. Every single player on that team is one of the best at their respective roles, and there is no debating it. They are a front runner to win this entire thing. Enough said. And lastly, we have the Shanghai Dragons coming in at the number 1 spot. I think most people knew these guys would be good, but their 2020 campaign has been nothing short of brilliant. They're essentially the APAC version of San Francisco, or maybe we should be saying that the Shock are the NA version of the Dragons. Whatever though, it's the exact same trajectory regardless. A few tough losses here and there, but sheer determination and dominance at every other corner, including 2 tournament victories. They had the most wins in the Overwatch League this year. They finished number 1 in the overall standings, and they have some of the best players in the league, along with 2 MVP candidates. The list just goes on and on with their accomplishments. There is nothing these guys can't do. I honestly do believe their results are a little more impressive than the Shocks or Fusions just because they're in a more competitive region. But the way they played in this, it really didn't seem like that. They were steamrolling everybody in their path. I feel like their biggest enemy this year was themselves. So long as they tried and had the desire to win, they usually did it. The one thing we could ever get on Shanghai for is not proving themselves against the top teams in NA, but I think they have a good sense of how to properly execute in any meta, so they'll probably do just fine matching up with them. The Dragons are number 1 in my eyes, no doubt. Well, there you go. It was long overdue, but that's what my updated power rankings are looking like. Here's what the rankings are looking like as a whole, and I'll even do a little then and now comparison between this and the preseason. And speaking of the preseason, there will be a video just laughing about my pitiful results in the future, so look out for that. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed the video, then it would mean a lot to me if you could like, subscribe, and comment what your end of season rankings are looking like. After that, consider following my socials or becoming a channel member if you wish to give me more support. And as always, thanks so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate you. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.